The current state of journalism is a pretty sad one. There was a time when journalists were seen as guardians of our democracy, a watchdog over the politicians and the corporations. They were investigators and revealers, moral guardians of our societies in many ways. Even back then, this wasn't entirely accurate and was more than a little self-aggrandizing, but there was an idealized system of ethics that was meant to guide their conduct. Those journalists who failed to abide by this conduct were outed by other journalists, in a not too dissimilar way to the way in which peer review is supposed to operate in science. Today, we have a far different attitude towards journalists. They are seen almost universally as partisan hacks who cannot be trusted, as liars, cheats, activists, as being biased, harassers, agents of cancel culture, or enablers of fascism. They have changed from the guardians of our society to one of the forces that is seen to be undermining it. Blame is cast in many directions on this. Some say that the media has been the subject of attacks by crooked politicians seeking to undermine them because of their own crooked ways. To undermine even the very notion of truth.
You are fake news. Go ahead.
Some blame capitalism. The need for media companies to be a profitable enterprise has driven a race to the bottom. Excesses in terms of headlines and stories that make the tabloid gutter press of old seem positively virtuous. Some blame the internet, the rise of the citizen journalist and the blogger, the immediacy of social media, which demands a more agile, less fact-checked form of news, and where we can hear from people on the ground, or at least claiming to be on the ground, before establishment journalism has even cottoned on to the fact that there's a story. Some blame the audience. After all, it is we, the readers, the listeners, and the watchers, who choose to click on the partisan headline, the sensationalist video, to be reassured and coddled in our existing positions rather than to be informed. It's no single thing. It's all of these, and more. For the longest time, the greatest number of people were illiterate. Literacy was limited to the upper classes of society and the clergy. Even the Bible, which loomed large in most people's lives, was rendered in Latin, another level of obfuscation which relied on an educated interpreter to bring the word of God to the people. Language itself, especially the written word, has long been considered magical. The ability to catch sounds and meaning out of the air and to render it into marks, even to write things into being. The word rune, for example, referring to one of the earlier forms of European text, means not only letter, but also mystery or secret. In Norse mythology, the writing of runes is not only symbolic of sounds and words, but is meant as a way of shaping and changing the world, of interacting with the forces that those runes represent. In Finnish, the word runo means poem, and comes from the same root. Their word for rune, rumokirjain, meaning scratched letter. So important and so powerful were these runes that Odin hung himself from a branch of the world tree, pierced his side with his spear, and gazed into the well of Erd to learn the runes from the Norns and the land of the dead. One of his names is Runatyr, the god of runes. The parallels with the crucifixion there are obvious, and in Judeo-Christian myth, God speaks the universe into being with a word, and the demons and angels of the pantheon can be bound with words, numbers, and letters. Ogham runes, similarly, are associated with forces of nature, trees, and the meanings and spirituality that go along with that. There is a magic to words, to writing, to inform, to pass knowledge for generations, to conjure whole worlds into being in the imagination, and ideally to inform. Language, and writing especially, has always had this sacred, powerful veneer, and while the idea that writing can change reality is rightly seen as laughable now, it can change people, and people can act in physical reality and create material change. The Prometheus of language, who brought it from the realm of the divine into the realm of the profane, was Johannes Gutenberg in 1439. With the advent of the movable type printing press, the ability to mass reproduce the written word became abruptly more accessible. There has probably been no more single earth-shaking technological innovation in the history of mankind, more so even than agriculture. Arguably more so even than the information technology revolution of our own age. Reproduction of the written word left the realm of scribes and scholars and individuals. It came out of the monasteries and into the hands of skilled craftsmen, and through them, the people. By 1500, printing presses had produced more than 20 million books. By the end of that century, 200 million. One of the first, most disruptive things the press did was to reproduce the Bible. Not only that, but to bring it down in translations to the common tongues of the various nations. No longer were you reliant on the priestly class to commune with the word of your God, but if you could read, even if it was only your own language rather than Latin, you could do it yourself. Protestantism, founded when Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, helped drive this. Protestants encouraged literacy so that people could read the Bible for themselves, and the Bible was still the one book that most people encountered in their lives. It's hard to understand now, but the written word, even through this period, still had some of its sacred quality. The social power that religion had, that the Bible had, as a sacred text, carried over to other printed material by association. People might have been literate, but so it is written, so mote it be, made them credulous. To this day we use the phrase taken as gospel to mean taken as unimpeachable truth, despite the obvious mythological nature of the Bible. The power of the written word upended society, not just religion, but in providing access to learning and scholarship. It was the engine of the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment and the Republic of Letters. It created a cultural awareness. It created the rise of nationalism and even the nation-state as an idea. It cemented and legitimized the European languages and undermined the use of Latin as a lingua franca. The written word made the modern world possible and the blossoming of science and understanding that it created. It also created a feedback loop that is still going, with an educated working class, and then the advent of a true mass media thanks to the steam-powered printing press and, more recently, the internet. That early sacredness of language, that credulousness that came with the divinity of the written word, had its downsides. Even into the 1700s, unscrupulous agents were producing propaganda and lies to shift the direction of political change and to foment revolution. In the 1600s, in England, the Civil War was whipped into a frenzy by the most outrageous pamphlets and claims that helped beat the drum of war and revolution and prejudice against Catholics. The propagandist nature of media led to a great many attempts to censor and control it, but it was continuing to become more powerful, to be in more hands, to be harder to control. The press, the steam-powered press, the mimeograph, the photocopier, the home printer, the internet, over time, from the pamphlets of the 1600s to the fanzines of the 1980s, and today the blogs and social media groups, too many people can publish. You can't stop them. An uneasy détente was found in the 19th century that has held until today, with journalists largely policing themselves. The debate had taken place in the 18th century between two broad ideological camps. Edmund Burke, perhaps, as the avatar of one, noting the power and influence of the press as a reason to regulate the Fourth Estate, as he called it. Voltaire as a champion of freedom in the other corner, whose position has been paraphrased by Evelyn Beatrice Hall as, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." A combination of self-regulation and limited regulation created a balance, along with journalistic ethics, until now. The code of ethics that is broadly supposed to guide journalists in the 21st century is as follows. Seek truth and report it. Minimize harm. Act independently. Be accountable and transparent. Even the most die-hard believer in the value of the Fourth Estate can see that these are not being adhered to. Journalism has always been a political sport. Sometimes it's the player, sometimes it's the ball. The Reformation was political, driven by the written word, as were the revolutions and revivals that also came in the wake of mass literacy, with the English Civil War and the French Revolution being perhaps the most notable examples. In the 20th century, this came to a particular and perhaps more relatable head, with the rise of two enormous world-shaping political forces: fascism and communism. Marxist philosophy appealed to the newly literate working class, and attempts to censor and suppress it by the existing governments, such as those of the Tsar, only made it more powerful and more appealing. The pseudo-scientific language of Marx and Engels appealed to the educated classes, and the relentless tide of reason. The promise of equality and fairness appealed to the suppressed and oppressed working class, under the boot of the Ochrana, the secret police. Fascist philosophy appealed to a nationalism and a sense of cultural and racial identity that barely existed before the advent of the printing press. Germany wasn't even a unified nation as a people until 1871, and yet, barely 60 years later, a Germanic identity and a sense of betrayal after the loss of World War I was enough to elevate a racist, vengeful, hateful, nationalistic ideology to supremacy over that country. Communist propaganda brought people to the same murderous rage that the pamphlets of the 1600s had, and, once the communists had power, it bolstered the state and sold the dream of the USSR to its people, over and over and over again. Opposition media was ruthlessly suppressed, even more viciously than the Tsar's regime ever had. They even called the state newspaper Pravda, which means truth, which is a little on the nose and utterly inaccurate. Fascist propaganda targeted the press itself, undermining its role and authority, undermining the very idea of truth. Lügenpresse, lying press, was not a term invented by the Nazis. It goes back to the 19th century and was employed by German Marxists in their criticism. But the Nazis adopted it and made it their own like never before. They denounced all press, save their own, as Lügenpresse, as being in the sway of Jews, communists and foreigners. The press itself, the Fourth Estate, was resold to the public as propaganda by propaganda, undermining the concept of reported truth. Obscene cartoons were used by both forces, and often there was little difference between the Nazi portrayal of Jews as greedy parasites and the communists' portrayal of capitalists as greedy parasites. There is a strange crossover of anti-Semitism that persists to this day on both the extreme right and the extreme left, albeit for different reasons. In the 1960s and 70s, old norms were challenged again. Underground comics and magazines, radical art movements, the student rebellions of 1968, all were steeped in a countercultural press, and even the mainstream was affected. Many of the great establishment names of today were rooted in the radicalism then. This is when press became mingled with activism, and the detached delivery of the stolid news anchor or columnist was challenged by gonzo journalists. Perhaps the best example of this was the Vietnam War, which also gave us the first real instance of political correctness in the modern era, not from the left, but from the establishment right, the politicians and the military. One example given in the unholy hymnal is preemptive counterattack, which in non-PC English means ambush. Reporting on the Vietnam War was relatively uncontrolled, relatively uncensored. Reporters, embedded with troops, lived alongside them, saw the true horror and atrocity of asymmetrical warfare. Whether they were activists or not, simply reporting the facts on the ground was a radical act, and it tore public support for the war into shreds. Many in the military hierarchy would continue to blame the media for the loss of the war, in a manner not too dissimilar to the way that blame was directed at the media in Germany for the loss of World War I. The lesson was thoroughly learned, however, and even in today's age of 24-hour rolling news coverage, reporters have never truly been permitted the same amount of leeway ever again, and control of information and interpretation of that information is now a priority for governments waging war. There has always been partisanship in the press. The UK's printed media establishment provides a good historical lesson on that. Tabloids especially have practically screamed at their bias from their headlines since their inception. Broadsheets have tried to maintain a lofty, more intellectual detachment, but their own political bias shines through almost as clearly, especially today. Even internationally, if you mention the Daily Mail, people know that it is a populist right-wing tabloid. Whereas if you mention The Guardian, a broadsheet, even internationally, people know that it is a left-wing, thoroughly middle-class newspaper. They do this to appeal to a particular audience, and they are a road marking on the way to today's polarisation. Everything is spun, ignored, or inflated to please that political audience. But, after decades of this, we've come to expect it, of the tabloids in particular, and sometimes it backfires and they make themselves into a political target. For example, in 1989, The Sun towed the party line for the Conservative government and the establishment by blaming the Hillsborough disaster on the football fans who were caught up in it, rather than the police and the safety standards of the club. They claimed that fans were picking the pockets of the dead, that they urinated on the brave police who were trying to save people, and even that they beat up an officer trying to give CPR. Understandably, this created outrage, particularly in Liverpool, and to this day, The Sun can barely be found within the environs of that city. Political pandering doesn't always pay off. Partisanship undermines credibility. Outrage people enough, and they have very long memories. Politics, whether as a chosen editorial slant from within or as a target of recrimination from without, is not healthy, particularly for the news media. Going beyond the facts into spin and interpretation and commentary, editorializing, only makes it easier for an outlet to be dismissed. To be dismissed as biased or partisan, even when it is reporting something true or factual or exposing a scandal. We all know some outlets are biased, but not all of them wear their bias on their sleeve in the way that the Daily Mail does. Adopting a political spin, carrying water for a particular political party, movement or ideology violates the ethical requirement of the media to seek truth and report it without bias, to act independently from these political causes, and to be accountable and transparent when they hide these biases and influences. Capitalism is defined as an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit, rather than by the state. To some people, capitalism is the greatest evil ever invented. To others, it is the greatest good ever invented. To most of us, I think we see it as something that is sometimes good, sometimes bad. A spanner does not make the greatest hammer in the world, and a hammer doesn't make the greatest spanner. Different tools, different systems, different policies are appropriate for different tasks. Regardless, we live in a, broadly speaking, capitalist system across the West, certainly when it comes to the overwhelming majority of the media that we consume. All of that, most of that, is either produced by or hosted on privately owned platforms. The public square is now privately owned, more so now than ever, given the nature of social media and the near monopolies of Google, Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. Where capitalism interfaces with the media, there are problems. There have been problems for a very long time, but they have accelerated thanks to the advent of the internet. It's worth taking a moment, however, to look at the alternative and why, perhaps even though it causes problems, a privately owned media might still be preferable. State media exists in many countries, either overtly or covertly. There can be little doubt, watching the snippets of North Korean TV that we see in the West, that this is a propagandist arm of the government. Like everything else in North Korea, their media is tightly controlled and mythologizes and elevates dear leader. There is no fourth estate. There's barely even a pretense that there is one. In the USSR, the state-owned paper was Pravda, Truth, but it only ever presented the governmental line, the Communist Party line. In most nations, state media is accountable to and dependent on the government for its money, and is tightly controlled in terms of the programming it can create, the messages it can put out, and the news that it can report on. For a state media body to report negatively on the government, whatever government that might be at the time, is to invite interference, defunding, and even abolition. There is immense pressure upon them to behave. In comparison to that state of affairs, a hodgepodge of competing media corporations with different slants and messaging and ideologies is obviously preferable. But the laissez-faire capitalistic approach also has its terrible problems. Before the internet really took off, Australian-American media mogul Rupert Murdoch was truly a kingmaker in the United Kingdom. At his height, he controlled the News of the World, The Sun, The Times, The Sunday Times, a huge slice of Sky Television, and Sky News, the UK's Fox News. He donated huge sums of money in addition to his media activities, supporting primarily the Conservatives. But it is his shift in backing Tony Blair's Labour Party in 1997 that is credited with helping push them to their landslide victory. Capitalism, without constraint or regulation, tends to do this. Power tends to accumulate in a very few, very rich, and very powerful hands, and they are then able to dictate the overall tone and direction that this media takes, and to use it to influence our politics. The Murdoch press in particular has been virulently anti-EU for decades, helping to push the Brexit debacle. Why? Because, as Rupert Murdoch is quoted as saying, "When I go to Downing Street, they do what I say. When I go to Brussels, they take no notice." He had sufficient power and influence to shape British politics to a large degree for decades, but he couldn't amass enough media influence over a larger body like the EU as a whole, and could only foment nationalistic hatred for it in response. Consider that Disney owns far more than News Corp ever did, including some of their old assets. The overwhelming majority of all media is owned by a handful of rather opaque conglomerates, some of which you've probably never heard of, like Sumner Redstone's National Amusements. If they have an agenda, even if it's just the protection of their intellectual property or the betterment of their own corporation, we're all going to feel it. Disney, for example, has been the major driver of the erosion of public domain rights, and that affects us all. Capitalism has a more immediate and obvious effect, however. You've all seen it, I'm sure. Some outrageous headline appears on your Facebook or Twitter timeline and, full of piss and vinegar, you click on it to see what it's all about. It's bait. It's trying to enrage you because rage drives engagement and clicks and conversation and argument. That's what provides attention, and that's what advertisers are paying for. Advertising pays for the site to be hosted. It pays for the writer's salary and everything else. Everything is dependent on clicks. Clicks are dependent on attention, and attention is, sadly, dependent mostly on outrage. Just to stay alive, to stay profitable, overheads have to be cut to the bone, salaries, benefits, and even the time spent on any particular story, because everything is time sensitive. This discourages fact-checking, editing, even so simple as a copy edit. It's all about speed, it's all about virality, it's all about rage. You don't get the best people, you don't get the best quality, and you can't spend the time to do the story properly when this is what it's all about. And that's how you end up with situations like Gawker or BuzzFeed. That's how the legacy media ends up chasing the same tactics, and everything gets dragged down to the level of the gutter press that they all used to lift their noses over. That's the stuff we read. The old internet adage used to be, information wants to be free. Now that might be better phrased as, the internet doesn't want to pay for information. We block ads because they're annoying. We click away when we hit a paywall rather than paying the money. We refuse to pay subscription fees or even to chip in with PayPal or Patreon or Subscribestar. The much vaunted microtransactions have never come to be, and even a single dollar is seemingly too much for people to pay, even for a month or a year of content. Even if you do release an article behind a paywall, all it takes is one person with access to cut and paste the text or do a read and respond on YouTube, and it's out there for free. And despite the oppressive and heavy-handed copyright protection protocols that are in place, that's it. Your work no longer really has value. Others give it away for free, or even monetize it themselves. This is unsustainable. When capitalism is the absolute driver of our media, it undermines every aspect of media ethics. The truth isn't profitable. Why not do a little bit of harm if it brings in the money? Whoever's paying you can tell you what to write. Business practices are often closely guarded secrets, and you're only accountable to the shareholders, not your audience. If we can't trust state media, and we can't trust private media, then what can we do? The BBC used to be an extremely well-regarded and trusted news source the world over. This has been eroded in recent decades as they have become more commercial and under increasing pressure from successive governments. Still, it was with remarkable foresight that, when the BBC was made fully public, it was as a statutory corporation, independent from direct government intervention, but funded, publicly, by a licence fee for televisions. This was in no small part due to its independent and impartial reporting as a private body in its early days, during the industrial action of the mid-1920s. The current charter document asserts the BBC's independence thusly. The BBC must be independent in all matters concerning the fulfilment of its mission and the promotion of the public purposes, particularly as regards editorial and creative decisions, the times and manner in which its output and services are supplied, and in the management of its affairs. The current charter runs until 2026, and I think this model is one that could serve other nations equally well. But we do need to reassert the BBC's independence and impartiality against the erosion that has been taking place. A lot of people are talking it down and saying it should be wound up. I believe the opposite. Convincing the people of some nations to fund a full media company from their taxation, I leave that task to others. Mass media was activist by its very nature from its inception, the accessibility of the Bible. It has been used in activism ever since, from radical pamphlets to political agendas, from rage-filled fanzines to murderous screeds posted on image boards. There has always been this undercurrent of politics, of taking your voice and amplifying it, of convincing or radicalizing others. This has, generally, however, been limited to the revolutionaries and the underground. It has been subcultural, radical, alien to the general populace. But this has changed. The respectable period of the mass media from the 19th century until the advent of the 21st was marked by a certain detachment. The screaming tabloids were largely seen as a lowbrow joke that few took seriously, at least that few serious people took seriously. You weren't being presented with a slanted view, exactly. You were being presented with the news, not a news. Comment and editorializing was segregated, and reporting was largely limited to the facts and the responses of appropriate people to it, experts, witnesses, people who mattered and who were influential on the topic. We tuned in or opened the paper to be informed, not to be preached at. It wasn't the internet that changed that, at least not to start with. The tabloids were always at it, pandering and propagandizing, but everyone knew it and regarded it with distaste. The rot probably set in with cable news. The punishing 24-hour news cycle needed more content, and the advertisers needed people to watch. It presaged what would later happen with the internet, decades earlier. Fox News was the most egregious example. Murdoch's political ambitions spreading to the US with a relentlessly propagandizing right-wing mouthpiece for the right wing of the Republican Party. People watched it, though. People watched it because they were conservative and liked the affirmation. People watched it because they believed that the news media up until that point had a liberal bias. People watched it because they were pandered to in what they already believed. People watched it for the identikit news Barbies in tight dresses. People watched it because, unlike the news channels before it, it was full of angry people giving their opinions, rather than detached people telling you the news. People even watched it because they hated it. And because of all that, it grasped a huge slice of media pie in short order, and, ever since, the other networks have been playing catch-up, which means that we have lost the very concept of the news and have replaced it with a myriad of different slants, spins and types of sensationalism to grab your attention. To piece together the news, you now have to construct your own monster, Frankenstein style, from pieces of facts from different sources, different pieces of a news. It's hard work, and few people will ever bother. They're happy to have their existing politics reaffirmed again and again. That's establishment political activism, though. That's big interests, big money, big politics. It's not the only kind of activist slant we've seen entering the media. There is a new wave of political correctness, a tsunami of wokeness that has consumed what used to be independent or customer-serving media. That goes back longer than we care to admit as well, all the way back to gonzo journalism, where the writer gave up any pretense of objectivity and inserted themselves into the story as much as any other participant. Amusing, interesting and radical as Hunter S. Thompson was, I don't know that it was worth it. The Fourth Estate is still powerful, though not as well regarded, and it has shaped our politics. When you can no longer pay the rates or spend the time on the stories that you once did, you don't attract the top-tier talent. What you do attract are people who get something else, something other, something more from reporting than a job, than a paycheck. You get activists. An activist isn't corrupted by money or favours. They arrive at the job pre-corrupted with an agenda. It may even be a wholesome and good agenda, but it is going to flavour everything that they do with that slant and even supplant the actual story. This is how you get games journalists berating gamers rather than reporting to them about games and whether they're any good or not. This is how you get radical feminist polemics in a blog about comic books. This is how you get Teen Vogue, a highly commercial online fashion magazine, publishing critiques of capitalism next to gushing praise for expensive sweatshop fashion wear. It's also how you get staff at these relatively well-funded larger outlets trying to use that size to crush their competition amongst independent reporters and creators. Anyone who counters their activist position are enemies to be crushed, are evil. They're not debate partners to be won over or bested. There is nothing wrong necessarily with being an activist. We all have values and beliefs, and this cannot help but colour our work and our writing, whatever we happen to do. We live every aspect of our lives according to the things that we believe and value. Journalism, as science, however, is supposed to have a professional code of conduct, of neutrality and detachment, of ethics. A good scientist conducts experiments as impartially as they can to gather the most accurate results and the best evidence that they can, and is subject to review by other scientists. A good journalist writes stories as impartially and fact-based as they can, subject to review by an editor and other journalists. Or they should. In online journalism especially, editing is virtually non-existent, and there isn't even a failed attempt to be impartial. If we're to fix that, the culture needs to change, but the economic forces are against that. They're against calm, reasoned, dispassionate, long-form reporting on the facts, the news. Activism violates journalistic ethics. It distorts perception, discards inconvenient truth, justifies harm. It doesn't act independently, it acts for the cause and bends everything to that purpose. Activists react very poorly to being held accountable or questioned, and are often not transparent until they're called out about their motivations, their entanglements, and their alliances. Second only to the printing press itself, the internet is probably responsible for the many changes and problems to which we are still acclimating in the current era. The internet has ruined the legacy media and ripped their funding out from under them. It has made everyone a reporter. It has opened up access to information to where we don't necessarily need a gatekeeper. It has made everyone a Google expert and a Wikipedia scholar. It has elevated the kookiest and stupidest arguments and ideas to a similar level of volume as authoritative and factual sources. In the early days of the internet, we were hopelessly optimistic. We had been primed by science fiction to see a planetary-scale repository of human knowledge as the primer for a second renaissance, for people being able to access all the brilliance and best of human achievement and to build upon it. We envisioned a brave new world of autodidacts, freely choosing to pursue their interests and bettering themselves and therefore the species as a whole. Instead, we got flat earthers and InfoWars. What we hadn't anticipated was the necessity of some form of gatekeeping, the requirement for tested and confirmed authority. We had a natural and understandable resentment of those who sought to censor, control and suppress information, and we wanted it to be free. The problem is that for all that since the advent of the internet we can access the best of humanity, we choose not to. For every digitized copy of Voltaire's Republican ideas, there are 100 video clips of Alex Jones ranting about crisis actors. Guess which one garners the most attention? For every well-researched, authoritative article about a contentious issue, there are 100 ranting lunatics. And the lunatics are more motivated and more visible. This first really became apparent after 9/11. Right from the get-go on IRC, innumerable Geocities sites, online diaries and blogs, the bullshit began to flow, a fire hose, a torrent of nonsense about holograms and inside jobs that still continues, albeit somewhat abated to this day. Bad information, the amount of bad information, far outweighs the amount of good information, and social media has only made this problem worse. Early search engines didn't necessarily feed this problem, but Google gained its dominance as a result of its algorithms, which at the beginning were all about popularity, commercialism, and interconnectivity, rather than quality or authority. This created a self-sustaining loop where the lunatics thoroughly took over the asylum, pushing down all the other content, the sane, sensible content, several pages away from your first search results. We needed gatekeepers, but we needed neutral ones. We needed to elevate quality content, but we also needed a way to agree as to what quality meant. Social media has begun to do this job, but the way that they've gone about it has only made things worse, thanks to political biases within the Silicon Valley bubble. Facebook, Twitter, Google, they've all exceeded the bounds of what we want from a platform, and have instead taken on the role of publishers, an action that, ironically, will end up eroding their protection from prosecution for hosting genuinely horrendous content. The internet is an upheaval technology, a black swan, especially in relation to news and media, just as the printing press was before it. We will adapt. It will just take time and it will be painful. It's impossible to know where this will all end up, but things can't remain as they are, and the adaptations taking place so far are not making things better. They're not thought through. The laws and ethical structures we already have in place come from debates in the 18th century. They were already crumbling by the 20th century, and they're all but gone in the 21st century. The public square, the internet, is firmly in private hands, where our rights and concerns as individuals have little or no power compared to that of the companies. Extending our human rights to free expression, imposing responsibilities on the companies, taking that into the private sphere may be the only solution. But to what extent and in what balance? We can only find out by doing it. No small part of the blame for everything that has gone wrong in mass media rests upon us, the audience. It is the audience that taps on clickbait, that allows themselves to be emotionally manipulated and continues to respond to it even knowing that it's clickbait. It is the audience that tunes in to 24-hour rolling news to hear the empty-headed opinions of talking heads who, for the most part, aren't experts and often have no idea what they're talking about. It is the audience that refuses to pay for quality reporting in media or, in the majority, to sit through anything that requires attention or a good amount of time to get into the detail. It is the audience that, in no small part, creates the angry commentary and hot takes that the worst of the media feeds upon. It is the audience that empowers cancel culture, that demands censorship, that creates a requirement for more heavy-handed intervention. It is the audience that now, with access to the internet and the fire hose of bad information that it contains, increasingly succumbs to the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, they believe, all the time, that their opinions and the information that they can find with a user-biased Google search tuned to show you content that you'll like over and again, that they know better than a reporter or even an expert. To some extent, however, the audience has also improved, and this has created a positive pressure on the media, but one that is reacted to with hostility. More people can access genuine knowledge and challenge poorly researched material. Experts in the field can comment, blog, talk directly to their audience and contradict that material. But the genuine, educated, knowledgeable critic is treated the same way as the Dunning-Kruger critic. Most tellingly, however, I think we're seeing the end of the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. The Gell-Mann amnesia effect is an idea coined by Michael Crichton, which summarised simply, paraphrased from his version, is something like the following. You open the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. You read the article and see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. You read with exasperation or amusement the multiple errors in a story, and then turn the page to national or international affairs and read as if the rest of the newspaper was somehow more accurate about Palestine than the baloney that you just read. You turn the page and forget what you know. I think this is coming to an end somewhat in a good way. The more knowledgeable audience, somewhat in a bad way, the Dunning-Kruger audience. Some of that erosion, some of that increased suspicion and skepticism is also occurring because the material, rather than being shared as part of a whole, a newspaper, a journal, a magazine show, is shared as an individual article on a particular topic. You don't buy a paper full of stories, including the one that you think is wrong, so you don't get a mix of material. You get particular articles from multiple sources on topics that you're already interested in and thus more likely to read and more likely to be knowledgeable on. Your exasperation and hostility builds rather than being diluted in areas where you have less confidence of your own knowledge. You also have more direct accessibility to the creators of the articles. Journalists no longer feel that they're on some other expert plane of existence. They're flawed human beings like the rest of us, and you see them on Twitter pouring scorn and hatred and distaste upon their own audiences. The skepticism and distrust that increased authenticity but lessened professionalism creates reflects on the profession of journalism as a whole. Every new scandal, every new lie, every new attack on the audience creates more media skeptics, more hostility, which makes the journalists and publications more hostile in return. The way out of this is a long, hard grind of professionalism on the part of journalists, and a degree of humility on the part of both the journalists and the audience, to try to remember, to reward, to value the good and accurate things that you read, to provide positive feedback, to skew towards that, and away from our natural tendency to remember and punish the bad, over rewarding and remembering the good. I don't like to be relentlessly negative. I don't like to just present the bad side of things. I think there are things that we can do. I've presented a few of these ideas already in the preceding sections. We need regulation of some sort, and we need self-regulation of some sort. We need a reassertion of journalistic ethics. We need watchdogs with teeth. As an audience, we need to move to punish bad actors and to reward good actors. We need the media to take its independence seriously, to avoid spin, to clearly delineate editorializing from content, to cast off political tribalism. We, as an audience, need to reward independent media, apolitical media, with our clicks, our money, and our emotional support. Activism is as bad for media as it is for science. In science, it has undermined confidence in whole fields such as psychology and social science. In the news media, it has undermined confidence in the journalistic enterprise as a whole. Activism and professionalism are not compatible in this space, save in specifically activist-oriented material. Publish your polemic against sexy computer game characters in Rain and Thunder, not on Kotaku. We need trustworthy gatekeepers on the internet. We need to both guarantee our rights on these platforms and regulate them to protect those rights. At the same time, we need to push them into neutrality and to get them to promote quality, even if it's outside our own existing biases and paradigms. We need to take responsibility for our own intake. We need to not click on the clickbait. We need to pay for the things that we appreciate and value. We need to make an effort to signal boost the good things, to compete with the manic profligacy of the insane and the conspiracy-minded. We need to check, to think, to follow the references, to burst our bubbles and to see other points of view, even if they make us furious. We owe it to each other. We need to take responsibility for who we follow, to block people who are abusive to us, rather than to ask someone else to do it for us. The Royal Society, a British institution and midwife to the birth of modern science as we think of it, has the motto nullius in verba. Loosely translated, this means take nobody's word for it. This is a noble goal as a guiding principle, a determination to check and to confirm the facts. Insomuch as is possible, trust should only be placed in those who have proven worthy of it. Whenever and wherever we can find the time, we should always check the things that we are told, without succumbing to bias or accepting simplistic contrariness because it comforts us in our existing position. We need alternative means to fund the media that do not distort it the way private media has been distorted. Some of that is on us to pay, but perhaps the public funding independent body model of the BBC can provide a starting point that we can agitate for. Most of all, we can change things, every one of us, by voting with our attention and our behaviour. It's a hard thing to change a habit, it's easy to backslide. But if we put our attention toward quality outlets who take the time to do it properly, who properly compensate reporters, and that those reporters take their ethics seriously, then we can really change things. Hard times encourage innovation and positive change as much as its opposite. Let's hurry the good stuff along.